Australia's universities are embroiled in a growing geopolitical storm. In recent months, pro and anti-Beijing groups have clashed on campuses and on the streets, amid rising concerns over the Chinese government's expanding power abroad.
Foreign interference is now at unprecedented levels in this country. It's a wake-up call to our university sector, a wake-up call to our business sector, a wake-up call to our government.
Universities earn billions of dollars a year from student fees and research collaborations with mainland China. There are growing fears that these lucrative arrangements may be endangering academic independence and even placing Australia's security at risk.
It's clearly not in Australia's interest to be recklessly training scientists who will go on to develop technologies that could be used against our military and against our country.
The accusations have fed into a deepening political rift between Australia and Beijing.
This is like Cold War. You're either a Chinese mouthpiece or an American mouthpiece. There's no in between.
I think it is actually like a witch hunt. Anything related to China has been labeled as some kind of threat. It's no longer yellow peril, but it's red peril.
Tonight on Four Corners, we investigate the infiltration of Australia's universities by the Chinese Communist Party through questionable funding deals, student activism, and research collaborations that are raising red flags. We reveal why our government and intelligence agencies are intervening amid evidence of Beijing's involvement in acts of high-tech espionage and research partnerships that could undermine our academic integrity and even our national security.
Australian universities have not been sleepwalking, they've been in a coma. It's astonishing. There is no excuse anymore. Perhaps 3 or 4 years ago, university vice-chancellors could have said, oh, well, we didn't know. That is no longer an excuse.
One day last November, an executive assistant at the Australian National University in Canberra read an email. It set off a cyber heist like none this country has experienced before.
As near as we can tell, the first thing that our hackers did is launch a spear phishing attack, but one where you didn't have to actually make a mistake. Normally you have to click on something. That was not the case. So this was really the A-team. They were able to do things that were impressive and very hard to stop.
Dear colleagues, I am a student in the Vice Chancellor's Student Leadership Program. I am currently working on a project which would require your help as a mentor.
Over 6 weeks, the hackers sent a barrage of spear phishing emails impersonating a student and staff to steal passwords for the university's databases. It wasn't till 6 months after the infiltration of the ANU began that the university discovered a database containing nearly 2 decades worth of records of current and former students and staff had been hacked.
The database went back 19 years and included several 100,000 people, and we do not know what data was taken of which person over what time. So they removed data from essentially the database that contains when you were a student here, your records, passport details, probably bank account details. The evidence shows this to be a highly organized, well-resourced, sophisticated actor, consistent with a state actor or, a very well-funded group sometimes associated with a state actor.
We understand that behind closed doors, intelligence agencies say the evidence points to the culprit being China.
That may well be the case, but it's not always in the interests of government, of course, or the Australian people to point a finger at a nation. And it may be that you don't have the literal smoking gun that you require for that irrefutable evidence publicly to make such an assertion.
Senior Australian security officials have told Four Corners they believe the Chinese government was carrying out a high-tech espionage operation to collect information that could be used to compromise and blackmail the victims.
ANU trains thousands of people who end up in the national security community. If ANU has materials on these people that could be used to compromise them, for example, a history of plagiarism or sexual harassment allegations, then this is incredibly concerning and could undermine our national security.
ANU graduate and influential China analyst Alex Josky was one of 200,000 people who was told his personal data may have been stolen. Josky believes the ANU has left itself wide open.
ANU is one of the world's leading universities for collaboration with the Chinese military. One example at ANU is that the ANU trained a scientist who was sent here by the Chinese military as a PhD student, working on artificial intelligence and specifically drone swarms, working together with ANU scientists who were receiving defense funding for the exact same research. When he went back to China, he was quickly promoted and is now head of the PLA, the Chinese military's drone swarm program.
We found 30 collaborations between ANU and Chinese defence universities.
Papers on aerial robots and drones, and research that could be used to help stealth fighters hide themselves while communicating with military bases.
All of the work that we do is in the public domain. So it's not secret research, it's not done for dollars, it is there, normally in some form that is much more generic. Now, there are abilities for things to be dual use, but we always, again, look at whether or not we think things are potentially able to do harm.
Since 2017, Australia's security agencies have been warning universities about the risks of foreign interference. Publicly, they don't name Beijing. 6 weeks ago, the Education Minister announced a university foreign interference task force.
Foreign interference is now at unprecedented levels in this country. There's been cyber intrusions which have occurred in the last 3 to 4 years, which should be a wake-up call to Australia, and it's a wake-up call to our university sector, a wake-up call to our business sector, a wake-up call to our government.
Every single university has discussions with security agencies about foreign interference, about the increased risk of cyber hacking. We've seen a particularly large and substantial incident at the ANU recently. So these are conversations that go on between individual institutions and security agencies, government, all the time.
We've got to make sure that our universities understand this threat, understand that they very much could be subjects to foreign governments wanting to interfere with the work that they've done. Obviously, our universities hold information which is incredibly important to our national security. So we've got to make sure we're working with them so that they understand the level of the threat and what needs to be done.
China is still a developing country.
The Chinese government and its supporters deny that China poses a threat.
We've noticed actually the ASIO and other intelligence units in Australia making allegations, direct or indirect, against China. We think actually these allegations are unfounded and without substantial, evidence. In Australia, I think there are some forces, anti-China forces, that are at play.
Chinese academic Professor Chen Hong was recently brought to Australia as part of a PR campaign and was provided to Four Corners by the Chinese embassy after it declined our request to interview the ambassador.
By most of the countries of the world and also the United Nations. I think to date, so far, there has been no clear evidence, evidence being produced by ACU to, as I said, incriminate China, to be doing anything.
Chinese students are caught in the middle of rising fears about the growing might and influence of Beijing's authoritarian regime. In August, Beijing loyalists came out en masse in Melbourne, clashing with pro-democracy protesters supporting the uprising in Hong Kong. The same weekend, pro-Beijing protesters also hit the streets in Sydney.
I think even the organizers did not realize how patriotic, how nationalistic the local Chinese community, especially student community, can be. They wanted a platform to be able to have a voice, and I think a lot of people there saw that rally as a platform to have their own voice, to say, we're proud to be Chinese and to be from China, and we're proud of the Chinese government.
Vicky Xu came to Australia as an international student in 2014 from China. Her worldview transformed as she studied political science at Melbourne University.
Growing up, the textbooks are full-on nationalistic. They teach you this narrative that China, in the last 100 years have been humiliated by the West. And, there's a very clear notion of China and the West are on opposite sides. And also in Chinese student handbooks, the number one rule would be love the country, love the party.
With Chinese student numbers at record highs, Australia's most respected and prosperous universities are in the midst of a cultural and political transformation.
Australian universities, especially the G8 universities, are heavily reliant on international students generally, but especially those from the PRC. The two main universities in Sydney, UNSW and Sydney University, it's nearly 2/3 of international students who come from the PRC. That's a heavy reliance.
We're standing up for the rights of international students, but we also, work for both international and domestic students.
At the University of Sydney, 1/4 of all students now come from China. Last year, aspiring politician Jackie He became the first Chinese citizen in Australia elected president of a university's Student Representative Council.
I didn't see what happened.
Today, he's campaigning for the re-election of his group called Panda.
So you can't speak Mandarin?
I can't speak Mandarin with you because of the
Yeah.
Many Panda members are pro-China, but pro-China does not necessarily mean, pro-CCP in any kind of way. And, we act on our own will, and we love the country our own will, and we love both Australia and China. There's no dichotomy here where, you have to either love one country or not, right? And the purpose of us existing is to bridge that gap between international and domestic students so that international students can have the help to be better involved in the community here. Just vote according to your own will. Just vote according to your own will. No one should be able to tell you how to vote. Just vote according to your own will.
An hour before polling closed, the Pandas were suspended from campaigning for breaching multiple rules, including campaigning in Mandarin and standing over students who were casting their votes.
from each country, and in such a way we can...
Last year, Jackie He was invited to give a speech at a competition for emerging Chinese-Australian youth leaders.
In Australia, every person has an Australian dream. Owning a quarter-acre block of land with a freestanding backyard, which means success and security. 在中国，我们同样有一个中国梦，那就是国家富强，民主振兴，人民安康。不管是中国梦还是澳洲梦，没有一个梦可以以一个国家的一己之力而实现。
In August, he filmed a segment for a Chinese state TV show called The China Dream, named after President Xi Jinping's trademark political slogan.
It essentially invited Chinese students from across the world, from various different countries like Canada, Romania, America, and obviously Australia, to come together and share their love and feelings about China and their stories with Chinese students and with China.
Jackie He says Chinese students are being unfairly vilified.
Media have been accusing Chinese international students of carrying out spy work in Australia. And I think to accuse these students who are already facing a heavy amount of burden, regardless whether it's financial, social, or psychological, to accuse them of carrying out spy work in Australia, I think is quite absurd. And the purpose of international students isn't here to carry out any spy work for the government in China. At least a vast majority of international students don't have any of this kind of intention at all.
At other universities, the rise of pro-Beijing student groups is fueling fears Australia's lucrative international student industry is a gateway for Chinese Communist Party influence on campus. The biggest group is called the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, which has branches on most Australian campuses. Incorporation documents from the ACT branch of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association say its mission is to assist the Chinese embassy, facilitate the connection between the embassy and the Chinese students and scholars, and that the board must communicate regularly with the embassy. The documents say all Chinese students and scholars will automatically become coordinating members.
I think universities have a really serious issue on their hands. They've let groups like the CSSA grow and expand on campuses, build their influence, build their resourcing, and this essentially gives the Chinese government a channel straight into the lives of Chinese students, even when they're outside China's borders.
The University of Queensland has been at the centre of the storm over Chinese political interference on campus. On an orientation day in July, the university was the scene of an ugly confrontation between pro- and anti-Beijing demonstrators.
Stand up, fight back! Stand up, fight back!
We decided to hold a protest on Market Day surrounding our university's close links to the Chinese state, because we decided that would be the best way to gain attention to the cause.
Student activist Drew Pavlou led a sit-in against Vice-Chancellor Peter Hui over the university's close connections with the Chinese government.
I led a chant, hey, hey, ho, ho, Peter Hui has got to go. And that was basically calling for Peter Hui to resign over his links to the Chinese Communist Party while these human rights abuses are being perpetrated. And then I led a chant, hey, hey, ho, ho, Xi Jinping has got to go. It was at that moment that I was attacked.
I heard noises like they were singing the national anthem and they were shouting the slogans. We heard them shouting China's Hong Kong, betrayers of China.
There were ugly scenes on both sides. There are close to 9,000 Chinese students enrolled at the University of Queensland. Their fees contribute $250 million a year. In the last 5 years, UQ received $24 million from agreements with Chinese institutions and companies. It also hosts a branch of the Confucius Institute, a language and culture program run by an arm of the Chinese government called Hanban, which gives UQ up to $400,000 a year.
The Hanban answers directly to the State Council, which is under the direction of the Chinese Communist Party, to meet the objectives of the Chinese Communist Party, which is stated as to promote, to tell China's story well around the world, and that's what Confucius Institutes are charged with doing.
Last year, the FBI's Assistant Director for Counterintelligence warned the US Senate about Confucius Institutes.
The Confucius Institutes, in my mind, are not strictly a cultural institute. They're ultimately beholden to the Chinese government. And there have been instances around the world in which those institutes have, say, quashed free speech.
The Confucius Institute at the University of Melbourne.
There are 13 Confucius Institutes in universities across Australia. They run classes on campus and in schools in several states.
Confucius Institute is university center.
The UQ Confucius Institute's founding agreement gives Hanban authority over teaching standards.
This is a mechanism for ethnic, essentially Communist Party apparatchiks or people that are so closely associated with it to actually get into foreign countries. That's the first thing. Secondly, they're used in part to propagate basically messages from Beijing, propaganda if you like. Thirdly, they're used to keep an eye on ethnic Chinese in universities.
The New South Wales Department of Education and Communities Confucius Institute.
Recently, the New South Wales Education Department announced it would shut down its Confucius Institute, which is running classrooms in schools, concluding there was a perception of influence from Beijing.
I deplore very much the decision made by the New South Wales government. I think it is actually like a witch hunt. Anything related to China has been labelled as some kind of threat. It's no longer yellow peril, but it's red peril, which is actually really shocking, to me.
University of Queensland Vice-Chancellor Peter Hoy has forged strong links to China. In 2013, he was appointed as an unpaid senior consultant to Hanban and was later made a member of the Council of Confucius Institute headquarters. Professor Hoy has also received Hanban's Outstanding Individual of the Year award. He stood down from Hanban last year after being advised he'd need to declare it under Australia's new Foreign Interference Transparency Scheme.
Isn't there a conflict of interest between your commitment to academic independence at UQ with your membership of the Council of the Confucius Institute headquarters?
I believe not. Australia, like any other country, has a foreign service. We always believe that in order to get the best out of open collaborations, that you have to engage and influence. And what I've been trying to do is to influence the way that the Chinese see their relationship with us rather than being influenced by the Chinese.
Are you confident that the Chinese government or Chinese Communist Party hasn't attempted to influence you?
I'm very confident that I haven't been influenced.
I think it is concerning, especially given what we know about the way the Chinese government sees education. In the Chinese government's eyes, education is a means of propaganda. of brainwashing and controlling the thoughts of people. So for an Australian university vice-chancellor to be advising the Chinese government on education from an optics perspective looks terrible.
In July, the University of Queensland made China's Consul General in Brisbane an adjunct professor, the fifth such appointment of a Chinese diplomat. He was nominated by the director of UQ's Confucius Institute.
The appointment of such people goes through a well-defined process at UQ. Anybody can nominate somebody for an affiliate position. Indeed, it's not unusual. We have 2,500 such positions.
After the UQ protest, the Consul General put out a statement praising the pro-Beijing protesters for what he described as spontaneous patriotic behaviour and condemning what he called the words and deeds of separatist countries.
I think it's quite incredible that a man listed by the university as a professor can seemingly endorse violence against students protesting and exercising their right to free speech and free assembly, and continue to be a professor at the University of Queensland months later.
Well, what it was what we thought as a government inappropriate comments, and the Foreign Minister said that, and the Foreign Minister was quite clear in saying that. And I think that is the most important thing, that she was very strong in saying, sorry, we do not think that is acceptable behaviour from the Consul General.
I'm not in the issue of debating with diplomats, but I made it very clear that we don't endorse any violent acts in a peaceful demonstration. And through that, you can conclude that I would disagree with somebody who would endorse that type of behaviour.
This year, UQ's Confucius Institute partnered with the School of Economics to develop a new course called Understanding China. The course received funding from the Confucius Institute, and the course director recently received an Understanding China Fellowship from Hanban in Beijing.
Well, it's very disturbing that the University of Queensland should allow its Confucius Institute to develop a third-year economics course. I mean, why would we permit a foreign authoritarian government through a Confucius Institute to play a role in determining the curriculum to be taught on an Australian campus? I mean, I find that bizarre.
China will be the largest economy in the world very soon, the largest trading partner for Australia, and an economy upon which our graduates very, very likely will depend for part of their livelihood. So having courses concerning China is totally appropriate. Is it appropriate that a Confucius Institute devises courses? No, it's not. But they don't. They are not involved in the design of the course. They are not involved in the delivery of the course.
Well, look, I think there needs to be a complete review in the University of Queensland. I think that course needs to be reviewed independently, and where the materials have come from, what the content is, what's there and what isn't there, and whether it's appropriate.
There's been a lot of concerning activity at the University of Queensland. It engages in particularly high levels of collaboration with Chinese partners, some of which has raised serious human rights concerns. So one example is that a scientist at UQ, Professor Shenheng Tao, set up a company in China called Koala AI that was commercializing his research and applying it towards monitoring people in the region of Xinjiang.
UQ Professor Shenheng Tao developed cutting-edge surveillance technology that's now being used as part of a mass surveillance program in China's Xinjiang province.
是不是？看来我们做的还是可以的啊。
Professor Shen has received $2.6 million in grants from the Australian Research Council.
He is no longer a professor at UQ. He stopped being an employee in 2017. I understand that he is back in China. He was an outstanding contributor to development of IT-related research at UQ, and that capability is now being deployed for Australia's benefit. What he goes on to do subsequent to having left UQ is something that we can't readily control or make judgment about because we are not privy to the details of his activities in China.
If you look at what the Chinese Communist Party is doing with technology domestically, it's best described as tech-enhanced authoritarianism. It's the ways that the Chinese Communist Party is using technology to augment its existing ways of ensuring state security. And to the party, its own political security, its own position in power, is at the core of its concept of state security.
Issue about ideological security, that the risk of people ever coming up with an idea that could threaten the party isn't there.
China analyst Samantha Hoffman has been investigating the Chinese government's mission to spread its AI surveillance technologies across the world.
They don't see a security risk because they're just using that technology for education services. They're using it for...
Her research has focused on a company called GTCom, a global data mining operation which is majority owned by the Chinese government.
GTCom, on the surface, is a company that provides translation services. But actually, they describe their activity as cross-language big data collection. And so essentially what they're doing is they're collecting bulk data globally and then turning that into, using that data to turn it into information that supports multiple different products. According to their own claims, the data they're collecting supports state security. And so immediately that raises red flags.
曾经仰望好奇，只觉遥不可及，如今脚踏实地。
GTCom spruiks itself as a pioneer of the technological revolution.
今天为之骄傲的，每一天我们在汇集的来自全世界超过65种语言的，覆盖了200多个国家的3000万条数据，每一天。
GTCom shares technology and data with China's tech giants, including Huawei, which was banned by the Australian government from the 5G network due to security concerns.
尽管在很多人眼中，
It's also very clear that the company isn't actually focused on the translation services that they're providing, but rather what they can gain through the data that they're collecting through those services. Then it turns into information that is usable in a variety of contexts, whether it's China's social credit system, efforts related to military-civil fusion, efforts related to military intelligence collection.
In 2017, GTCom sponsored a summit held in Brisbane by the International Federation of Translators.
And be tolerant.
The University of Queensland was a delegate sponsor.
Thank you very much.
At the summit, GTCom signed an MOU with the University of New South Wales to test its translation technology.
It appears that GTCom was using its sponsorship of that event as a way to improve its presence and to create a presence in Australia. They held an event in Sydney afterwards. They claimed to reach some kind of at least verbal agreement with other universities in Australia on potential cooperation in the future. So essentially they used this particular event, which is loosely linked to GTCom's business model, as a way to gain a foothold in Australia.
One of the reasons the Australian community, government, perhaps universities should be concerned, is that Australia's science and technology priorities are being set by the Chinese government because we enter into collaborations that have really been designed to support China's science and technology goals, not ours. The problem of due diligence spills over there, not just from the question of wasted resources. Should we be putting funds into collaboration around achieving somebody else's national strategic objectives? But also because there's a possibility that some of this research will go towards uses which could place Australia at risk.
近年来，以人工智能为代表的新科技正在驱动人类社会急速驶向第4次工业革命的新纪元。
GTCom also has a strategic partnership with a Chinese company, Haiyun Data, which provides technology for the police surveillance of ethnic Uyghurs in Xinjiang province.
做 AI 场景的筑梦师。
Haiyun Data, they work on technology to support the ministries of public security, the police, across China. So they work on surveillance-related technologies or the visualization of surveillance data. And they provide that to public security bureaus across the country, including in Xinjiang, where we know that technology is being used in its most coercive forms. They also are developing a lip-reading technology. To say, for instance, be able to read lips off of a video where there was no audio recorded, like a surveillance video.
In January this year, Chinese media reported the announcement by Haiyun Data of the establishment of a joint artificial intelligence laboratory with the University of Technology, Sydney.
There's very little information about the deal available. It's only available in Chinese language media, but we can see an image of director at Haiyun Data with an academic at UTS Sydney. There's images of the agreement.
I would like to use this opportunity to thank my team members.
The UTS academic was Associate Dean and Director of the University's Centre for Artificial Intelligence, Professor Jie Lu. Last month, Professor Lu won a $3 million fellowship from the Australian Research Council for a project to enable artificial intelligence to learn autonomously from data.
Centre of Artificial Intelligence. Thank you.
Samantha Hoffman is concerned by the UTS Haiyun Data connection.
All you have to do is search a company like Haiyun Data in Chinese on Google, and very quickly you'll come up with their relationships to the Ministry of Public Security in particular and Ministry of Public Security colleges. Because as soon as you have a company that's involved in the Ministry of Public Security and one that advertises actually very openly that it is involved in Xinjiang and that police state, you have to ask why does UTS find that acceptable?
UTS has told Four Corners there is no joint lab, but it has confirmed a research project with Haiyun Data to develop technology for handwriting recognition.
It seems as if Haiyun Data has built a relationship with scholars at the university, but we also know that UTS Sydney seems to have signed other agreements that, while not technically illegal, raise major red flags.
We need to ask the social and political consequences of our technology advancement and our adoption of technology. Just very broadly, we need to start understanding the implications. And so if there is a firm that's backed by a regime that doesn't purport to be a liberal Western democracy, and it's engaging in what could be developments that help suppress people, then that's a dangerous thing.
In 2017, UTS signed a $10 million deal with a state-owned military company called China Electronics Technology Corporation to fund a new high-tech research centre. One of its projects focused on public security video analysis. The company, CETC, had earlier developed a mass surveillance app used to monitor Uyghurs in Xinjiang. UTS denies its research contributed to the app, But Four Corners can reveal it's abandoning the project and 2 others with CETC because of concerns expressed by Australia's Defence Department.
Anyone seeking money needs to quite clearly understand what obligations are associated with that money, and they also need to understand, in the case of researchers, what the technology they're researching could be used or misused for. We need to understand that technology can be abused, and in a society where technology is ubiquitous, and it is now in Australian society, then we've got to ask questions about whether or not we're contributing to something that will end up becoming quite an oppressive thing for us and for other people.
Should Australian universities be contributing to Chinese surveillance technology through research partnerships, given China's abysmal record on human rights?
There are a set of rules about what's allowed and what's not allowed in terms of research. The Defence Trade Controls list is a very long list. It's reviewed every single year to keep it really up to date, and universities aren't just diligent, they're incredibly diligent about making sure that their research collaborations are absolutely inside the letter of the law. Apparently universities, as Defence told us recently, over-report rather than under-reporting.
China's next major research venture in Australia is currently being developed at the University of New South Wales. The Torch Innovation Precinct is the Chinese Science Ministry's overseas high-tech research zone and will host more than 60 companies, including Huawei and CETC. Chinese companies have so far committed $47 million to the project.
I see the Torch Technology Park, which is part of Beijing's technology transfer from the West to China, as the plundering of some of Australia's most valuable intellectual property. The university seems oblivious to the risks. I think the University of New South Wales is one of a handful of universities in Australia which is completely in denial about what's going on, but is so tied in over many years to its networks, including its personal networks in Beijing and China more broadly, that it's lost the ability to have some perspective on what the university is doing with its engagement with China.
The University of New South Wales says it takes its security and compliance obligations very seriously and is keen to work more closely with the government to ensure its operations are always in line with the national interest.
It's a very, very careful balance. It's absolutely fundamental that the autonomy and the openness of Australian research and collaborative research is absolutely maintained. We're a relatively small population country. If we didn't collaborate on research, we would be in very, very serious trouble. I think the processes as they are inside Australian universities are very careful, and any laws, any things that government decides are not on are absolutely adhered to.
Universities are now on the front line of a clash of political and academic cultures that's posing greater challenges to the industry than ever before. Their entanglement with China's authoritarian regime is putting Australia's academic integrity, human rights commitments, and national security at stake.
We're all dealing with what is an emerging threat, a threat which has reached levels of unprecedented proportions. So we want to make sure it's very clear what the responsibilities of universities are when it comes to collaborating with any government, foreign government, because it's incredibly important that we get that collaboration right and that collaboration is in Australia's interests.
Some universities are starting to get the message. Many universities just have their ears closed. They're unable to hear the kinds of warnings. There is no excuse anymore. Perhaps 3 or 4 years ago, university vice-chancellors could have said, oh, well, we didn't know. That is no longer an excuse. Naivety is no longer an excuse.